Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you all for coming on a beautiful evening in Amsterdam when you could be doing many other things. So I'm delighted that you're here, and I hope we have a good conversation and lots of... I want to talk later with Andrew about some of the political issues that he raised, but I did want to talk to you first about consolation. I'm going to do something slightly odd. Many of you have not read the book, but I'm going to give you my second thoughts about the book. So that's slightly odd, but believe me, we'll get there. I want to, so the talk is called The Spirit of the Staircase, Second Thoughts on Consolation. And I want to begin by telling you a quite well-known story about a great figure of the European Enlightenment, Denis Diderot, who was, as many of you know, the man who basically created the encyclopédie, the first great collection of Western knowledge in the 1750s and 60s. But this is from a different part of Diderot's life. One night in the 1770s, as Diderot tells us in his essay, The Paradox of the Actor, he attended a great dinner party upstairs in Paris. And at one point, towards the end of the dinner, one of his friends directed a very cutting remark in his direction. And when the company turned around to look and see what Diderot would reply, because he was a famous, he had famous repartee, Diderot astonished them by collapsing into kind of sheepish silence. He didn't know what to say. And afterwards, as he came down the stairs on his way home, feeling a little humiliated, it occurred to him what he should have said upstairs. And it's this story which has led to the coining of a phrase that's famous in French, esprit d'escalier. In German, I think the phrase is Treppenwitz, and I don't know what you Dutch folks do, but you probably have something good. It's mistranslated in English as the spirit of the staircase, although the mistranslation does capture what's uncanny about being at a loss for words and then feeling them surge into consciousness again when it's too late. In a certain sense, Diderot's story, in a way, is a story of consolation. I mean, after all, it's still better to remember what you should have said rather than never have any idea what you should have said at all. I start with that story because writing a book can leave you with a sense of an esprit d'escalier, and that has been the case with On Consolation. It was a book I worked on for many years, and unlike most books which consume the questions you initially asked so that you never want to return to them or can't even remember what they were, in the case of Consolation, I keep having new thoughts, partly because I talk to groups like yours and I come away with things to think about. And every time, as it were, I go down Diderot's stairs, I think of something I should have said when I was upstairs among all the brilliant figures who kept me company when I was at work on the book: Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, St. Paul, Montaigne, Hume, Camus, and Privot-Levy. And the issue that I want to discuss with you or share with you is this: is consolation in the domain of truth, that is, in the domain of philosophy, or is it in the domain of rhetoric, the domain of art? Why is that a question? Because I think for 2,000 years, consolation was a philosophical subject. With Socrates and Plato, consolation was firmly a philosophical duty. And Socrates' death, as recounted by Plato, remains the most famous of all our attempts to die philosophically. And how does Socrates do it? You'll remember, he does it by attending to the truth of the experience, the coldness in the fingers, the drowsiness in the head, as the hemlock begins to have its effect. And in this account, consolation is paired with truth. And so to be consoled is to be lucid in the face of the irremediable. And this tradition continues with Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, Seneca's Letters to Marcia, Marcus Aurelius. Although I have to say that the Stoic advice that these great Roman Stoics offer people when they face death and suffering and reversal is not especially consoling, at least not to me. And one of the interesting things I discovered is that it didn't even console Cicero. Cicero is a very interesting example. I tell the story in the book where he was the great promoter, popularizer of Stoic fortitude in the face of suffering, and then his daughter died. And you ought to read his letters when his daughter died. He's just devastated. And so that was a moment when I began to ask, well, does philosophical Stoicism console as much as it pretends to? And I began to think that the purpose of philosophy may be to teach us how to live and how to die, but propositional reasoning is rarely as comforting as a good story, as we all know from our childhood when our mums and dads read to us. Let me give you an example of what I mean here. Boethius, the Roman senator who was executed by a barbarian king in 524 AD, wrote one of the great works of consolation called the Consolation of Philosophy. And it looks like finding consolation through philosophical reflection. But actually, when you look at it closely, it's an exercise in storytelling, in which a desperate man facing execution, the prisoner, imagines a lady philosophy entering his cell. Boethius creates this fantastic character. He describes her dress. She's got slightly ratty clothes. She's got certain tokens of knowledge. Her hair is a little askew. It's kind of a touching, almost indirect portrait, I think, of his own wife, who he missed desperately. But Lady Philosophy comes into his cell and comforts him. How does she comfort him? By simply his company, by simply offering him the company of his presence. And so what you're looking at is a great philosopher, Boethius, telling himself a story to conjure away the dread of dying, and creating a character, Lady Philosophy, who shares his solitude. And this, it seems to me, is a very interesting hint about how we should understand consolation. Because the fact is, and I think this is what Boethius is facing, is that it's very hard to face the truth of your imminent execution. It's very hard to deal with the truth of loss and failure in our own life. And we tell ourselves stories knowing that they're stories. And that's what I'm interested in. The ways in which we use stories to console ourselves, knowing that they're stories at the same time. How does that work? One of the people, interestingly enough, who was fascinated by this was Diderot. Diderot was fascinated by this human quality, and he studied why it was that we accept dialogue in a theater and the display of emotion conjured up by great actors as if it were real through a willing suspension of disbelief, to use Coleridge's famous phrase. And that helps me to see, as I didn't see when I wrote the book, the extent to which consolation is a performance. You need to think about it with analogies to theater. And I think it's a mistake now to believe that consolation proceeds by proof. It works through the art of persuasion. And in persuasion, as we know, it's the speaker and their rhetoric, not just the speech and its content, that does the persuading. And I think we know this if you think about having been in a situation where somebody comes to console you for the loss of one of your loved ones, and they come to see you. Sometimes what people say to you is less important than that they say it at all or say it well. It's the performance that's moving to us, not necessarily the content. And in the performance of consolation, we play a very important role. In the Jewish faith, they have this wonderful tradition of sitting Shiva. And when you sit Shiva in the Jewish faith, people come to your house and they sit around in a room and they tell touching stories or emotional stories about the departed. And those who have suffered loss thank them for their presence, for the respect that they show by being there. And so we're consoled by their presence, by their recognition, by their acknowledgement of our family, without necessarily believing a word of what they say about the departed. So there's a gulf between what they say and how they say it. Let me give you another example, more personal one. At the burial of my own father on a windswept hill in Quebec in 1989, an Orthodox priest came down from Montreal to officiate at the graveside because my father was Russian Orthodox. And at the end of every Orthodox funeral, we all join in singing a song called the Viechnaya Pamyat. Now, I don't speak Russian, but I do know what the words mean, and they mean, eternal memory grant unto him, O Lord. So when you sing that song, you are consigning your father to the eternal memory of God. And I'll always remember singing those words over the whistling of the wind on the hillside. And the consolation I felt was a complex of very complex emotions. I felt we'd done right by him. We'd buried him as he would have wished, beside his parents, with the words he wanted. And the fact that the priest was wearing sneakers that peeked out beneath his liturgical gown didn't take away from it, because in a way it was a kind of symbol of this very humble church of exile in which my father had spent his life. And if I didn't actually believe that God's memory is eternal, it didn't matter, since it spoke powerfully to a longing that I had for my father, and I assume you have for your loved ones, that he would not be forgotten. So those funerals are performances, and I think my book didn't capture the performative aspect of consolation as well as it should have done. But it's also true when there's no performance, when we're alone. Even when we console ourselves alone, for failure, for example, we're engaged in a performance with ourselves. One inner voice says, well, you did your best, while another inner voice says, really? Are you sure? And that inner dialogue of doubt and affirmation can go on for years. And in the meantime, we sustain ourselves with a consoling fiction until we accept that we won't actually ever know whether we gave it our best. All that we can be certain of is that our best wasn't good enough. But when we make that admission, the dialogue ceases and we get over it. The consoling fiction that we did our best has done its work. We move on, and a new chapter in our life can begin. I guess I want to say to you something that I guess is obvious, but if you're an intellectual, you are always rediscovering the wheel. We should not be ashamed to turn to consoling fictions. Facing any of the truths about life is hard. Shakespeare understood this when he has Lear repeat over and over as he holds his dead daughter's body, never, 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 as if the truth keeps escaping him, as if the finality is more than he can bear. And in the next instant, as if he cannot stand the truth, Lear thinks he sees her breathing. Pray, you undo this button. Thank you, sir. Do you see this? Look on her. Look her lips. Look there, look there. And so King Lear dies believing not that she's gone, but that she might still be alive. And when we struggle with unbearable truth, we resort to fictions which we half know to be false, but which help us at least to get through the next moment and then the next until nothing hurts quite the way it did. But it's at this point that my philosopher friends would say that consolation dependent on fictions is no consolation at all. Philosophers are the custodians of one of the most noble ethics of modernity, which is that we should not be deceived by our own illusions, and hence the deep reluctance of philosophy towards the very idea of consolation. Reconciliation with the facts, yes, acceptance of the truth, however hard. Lucidity is the goal of philosophy, whether it's consoling or not. And in defending lucidity as the goal that we should seek in relation to suffering, philosophy has always tried to hold the line against succumbing to yearnings for meaning when no meaning is to be found. And for these reasons, philosophy has vacated the terrain of consolation, at least since David Hume, and has left it to the domain of the psychologists, the psychoanalysts, and the religious. Yet the question of consolation doesn't go away just because philosophers find it intractable. For we continue to be consoled by consolations we do not happen to believe. I, for example, read the Psalms, and I feel solace, kinship with their description of the spiritual yearning and loneliness that they describe. Many of us listen to religious music and feel deep consolation from work that is composed to glorify a God in which we do not happen to believe. And this seems to me a very interesting fact. Why is it so? And here I go back to Diderot. When we think about consolation, we're thinking about the same question that Diderot asked in The Paradox of the Actor, which is why performances exert such a cathartic effect upon us even when we know they are an exercise in pure rhetoric. Diderot is a wonderful guy for many reasons, but one of the greatest things he did was to sit by the hour in the dressing rooms of the great actresses of his day. And instead of treating them as, loose women, he understood these were some of the greatest artists of his time. And he listened to these great female actresses, and they told him very bluntly that actors do not express their emotions. They produce them to serve a text. They perform the emotions, and one of them said, you perform them preferably with an icy heart. In the theater, rhetoric produces an effect independent of and despite the truth. The actor imitates sincerity, plays at being authentic, without being the least authentic themselves. So by analogy, when we listen to Mozart's Requiem or Bach's Matthew Passion, we suspend disbelief exactly as we do in the theater. We discard the question of whether we believe in the doctrines these magnificent pieces of religious music depict, and instead surrender to the impact their performance has upon our emotions. And whether we think Christian doctrine is true or false seems irrelevant to the power of this great music to console. And so this leaves you, if you're a non-believer like me, seeking to have it both ways, and it's an uneasy place to be. Refusing assent to doctrines that no longer convince, while holding on to the rhetoric of religious consolation, since secular life has no substitute. But that then raises another question. If an unbeliever like me does not believe in religious faith, do I have the right to be consoled and moved by religious rhetoric? To which one might reply, why not? We don't ask whether we have the right to the tears we shed when we go into the cinema or theater and start to cry. We just cry. So why should we be required to justify the consolations we derive from traditions that are no longer ours by conviction? One reason might be that consolation is more than comfort. It's more than catharsis. It's a settled state of belief. And so for consolation to be enduring, it must be truthful, and it must convince. And here's, I think, another thing that when you think about this, you begin to see. As anyone who has actually cried in the cinema, and I'm an easy crier, conviction structures our very emotions. We don't just surrender in the cinema, we evaluate. and emotions must convince us just as surely as propositions must. So as a story unfolds on the screen or on the stage, all of us have a whole arsenal of negative terms that we use to detect and ward off manipulation of our emotions. So if we feel this is kitsch, the barriers go up. If we feel it's kind of sentimental, goes up. If we feel it's another Hollywood game with our emotions, our guard goes up. There's an evaluative process to our emotional reactions that is unceasing. Even when watching a performance, in other words, we're concerned with the issue of emotional truth, and rightly so, for a very good reason, because we don't like being manipulated. The performers we love, the performers we remember, the ones that do console us, seem to us to be truthful. They do not manipulate, they illuminate. Indeed, one of the reasons we're so attached to certain artists is they define for us what certain emotional states are. So if you love a certain kind of pianist, one of the reasons you may love that pianist is that he defines what it is to express pathos, or to express joy, or to express... He has some capacity to capture the truth of that for you. But notice that we're always evaluating these emotional reactions. So if I go back to where I started, I need to revise my original question about whether consolation dwells in the domain of truth or in the domain of rhetoric. I think consolation is fascinating because it dwells in both realms, because in both reason and emotion are at work together. In both our emotional life and our rational life, the question of truth is unavoidable. We question our beliefs, we question our emotions, and we will only accept consolation from beliefs and feelings which ring true to us. And another test of truth in the experience of consolation is whether we trust those who console us. Consolation is a social act. It's one of the deepest tests of human solidarity. It's a test of trust at the most intimate level. When we're grieving, we ask ourselves, do these people who've come to console us for our loss understand what we're going through? Even in grief and loss, we do this, and we do this for the same reason that we check our emotions at the theater or the cinema. We do not want to be manipulated, especially not when we're looking into the abyss. So consolation also depends on psychic attributes that distinguish human beings as such, namely empathy, the capacity to imagine another person's state of mind and act out for them expressions of sympathy that relieve their suffering. But even empathy is open to evaluation, because empathy is a performative and iterative process. The mourner assesses whether their words of comfort are getting through. The grieving person evaluates whether they trust the words that have been given. To be consoled, then, is to trust somebody in a moment of crisis, and to believe, and then, if possible, to surrender to that fusion of emotions in which you feel that the person truly understands what you're going through. That this is a performance which we stage with another doesn't make it any less real, any less foundational to the maintenance of the moral world on which we all depend. So I'm coming to a conclusion. We'll hope we get to a discussion pretty quickly. Thinking about consolation illuminates the relationship between thought and feeling, between truth and fiction. And it takes us into some of the insatiable heart of our species, because we don't just suffer pain, we suffer about the suffering. We ask questions about why we must suffer, why existence is as it is, why life doesn't live up to our hopes and expectations. And in the search for answers to those questions, we trust neither our emotions nor our reasons, nor the emotions and reasons of those who come to our aid. We evaluate constantly in both emotional and rational modes of being, seeking as best we can to attain emotional and rational truth alike. Why? Because we would like to be sovereign. We do not want to be manipulated by ourselves or by anybody else. Yet the painful reality of life is that truth often escapes us, and the truth is often hard to bear. We don't want to be crushed by life. We want to live. We want to recover the joy of living. We all want to live in hope. And so to bear what must be borne, we settle, at least temporarily, for fables, for inventions, for narratives that help us to remain hopeful in the face of facts that include death and dying, failure and loss, Ukraine, pandemics, and all the rest. To think about consolation, I now see, is to venture into the domain of philosophical anthropology, who we are as a species, and to try and understand the ways in which both truth and rhetoric, philosophy and art, have served to give us whatever purchase we ever have over who we are as human beings. Because we're not only performers on the stage of life, we're performers who seek to make sense of the performance, to understand it both from the inside as we play and from the outside as we watch, and to grasp the inner rationale of those rituals of consolation that we enact to take away our dread and our sorrow. As Diderot understood, we often grasp the meaning of the performance only after it's over, when it's too late to change anything. But hey, it's always good to learn, even on the staircase. Thank you.
So that was fantastic, Michael. Thank you so much. We'll talk for maybe 30 minutes and then take some questions from the audience. You talk about, and I strongly encourage everyone who hasn't read Michael's book to read it. It's a wonderful book. It's unexpected, not that I didn't expect it to be good, but it's unexpectedly good in the sense that it's Michael, I think, at his most poignant and his most personal. But of course, many of you will know him as a political writer. In my introduction, I noted that we first met for our How to Fix Democracy show. And Michael is distinguished. His career has been built around his analysis and observations about politics. When you talk, Michael, about consolation as performance, and your interest in consolation in that sense, is that also your interest in politics? Isn't politics about performance too?
Oh, certainly. It's and having been a rather bad performer, kind of in a B company, I know something. I know more about when performances don't work in politics than I know when they do work. What makes politics extremely complicated is that it is a performance art. There's certain absolute rules to the performance that you don't know until you've done it. One of them is that in every audience, you have to establish that you are one of them. If there's any them and us, you're done. You have to establish a connection with an audience because you're asking for their votes, for God's sake. And if they think you're superior, above them, too clever by half, all the things, you're toast. So you have to, there's a performance of, I'm one of you. And that's not easy.
It's not easy, but it's what distinguishes the greats from the less greats. For those of you who haven't looked at the book, it's made up of a series of chapters on individuals, on individual performers, people skilled in the art and the act of consolation. And hearing that introduction, Michael, the chapter that really comes to mind is the one on Lincoln, because you really present him as a master performer when it comes to consolation. And I think perhaps he could be your exhibit A in that context. Is that fair?
Well, I'm glad you there's a chapter in the book about Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural, which he delivered 40 days before he was shot. And it's probably the greatest speech in the democratic tradition. Next to Pericles is right up there. And why is it so great? It's because he's got a political problem which is truly excruciating and very current. What's current is polarization. He's been inaugurated to be the president of a society that has been in a civil war for 4 years. The civil war is ending with the Union victory, and what he's keenly aware of is that both sides of this civil war believe that God was on their side. That's his problem.
Quite literally, God on their side, right?
Yeah. How do you bind together a people who believe that God is on their side, each of them separately? And he then reaches for something that I think is extraordinary. He uses, because he was deeply schooled in the Old Testament tradition, he uses, I think it's Psalm 19, to basically say to the audience, we don't get to know whose side God is on. The nature of human politics is we don't get to know. We have to do politics in a world where no one has that certainty. So it's one of the great rejections of fanaticism and certainty in politics. And then it ends with him saying, but we know what we have to do here. What we have to do here is that both sides have widows and orphans. And we have a common project, which is to comfort the widow and provide for the orphan. And we will continue to disagree about the rightness and wrongness of the Civil War. I think he's perfectly prepared to admit that. But our duties here and now to each other are perfectly clear. So it's one of the greatest speeches about, I guess, a liberal politics, in the sense that our politics can't work at all if someone thinks God is on my side and not on your side. It can't work. It breaks down. And Lincoln understands this deeply, and that's why, and it's a consoling speech, because it's saying, we can find a way through this. We can find a way through this provided we give up thinking God was on our side. Give up thinking that to the victors go the spoils. Give up thinking the vanquished must suffer permanent humiliation. Give up those ideas and move forward together with the simple tasks of just digging ourselves out of this awful war. So it's a kind of, and unfortunately, his assassin was in the crowd listening to the speech, and 43 days later he was shot. One of the most tragic moments in the history of politics.
You present consolation as an individual thing, and I think that's no coincidence, as I suggested in the intro, because of your liberalism. But what about the idea of collective consolation? The South has been in that state since the Civil War, which I think accounts for the current crisis in America. You made your name. First book I ever read by you when I was an undergraduate was a wonderful book on nationalism, which is a phenomenon in the business of creating collective consolation, whether it's the Serbs or the Irish or so many other narratives. Is collective Consolation, Michael? Is it credible? Why didn't you really discuss it in this book?
Yes, this is a book very much about the personal, as you say. It's not. And there's somewhere in the book towards the end I say, we're not consoled by doctrines. We're not controlled by theories. We're consoled by people, real people. And that was something I came out believing very strongly. You have to think about consolation, I'm now saying as a performance, but it's a performance involving two people. It's a ritual exchange of sympathy and understanding and saying, we're going to get through this together. Can you then, extrapolate that to the general, to the nation, to the
or the family even?
Well, to the family. Since I don't believe that consolation, we derive consolation from doctrines, and since the book has a couple of chapters about some of the doctrines that were most influential as consolations in the 19th and 20th century, Marxism is a deeply consoling doctrine. It says there is a revolution, it is going to come, we possess a science of history that will predict when it happens, and that doctrine consoled millions of people. There's an extraordinary, chilling story about Primo Levi, the great Italian writer who survived Auschwitz. And he comes out of Auschwitz in February 1945, and they've set up a place to shave people, the survivors. And he sits in a barber's chair, and he's being shaved by a French prisoner of war who was not in the, prisoners of war had a different status than the people set up for extermination, so he survived. And the French prisoner of war is talking to Primo Levi, and Primo Levi says, I got pretty depressed in the camp. I didn't think I was going to make it. And the French prisoner of war says to him, Mais Joseph était là. Joseph Stalin was there. How could you possibly lose hope? It seems ridiculous to us now, but it's terribly important. This is what I mean by doctrine. This was a doctrine that consoled millions of people, including in this country, for endless amounts of disappointment when politics didn't turn out the way they wanted. So I think going through that, you think, the fewer doctrines like that, the better, is kind of what I think. But we ceaselessly produce rhetoric that is essentially consoling in function. I mean, the doctrine that does most of the work for most of us is the doctrine of progress. It helped to get us through the pandemic. We thought, this is pretty bloody awful what's happening, but we have sequenced the virus very quickly. We've got a virus, we've got an RNA vaccine in production very quickly. Fewer of us are going to die than died in the Spanish flu per capita. And that's a rhetoric of progress. That is, science and technology will get us through this. And I think a lot of us, I certainly did too, clinged to that notion of progress. So that's an example of a collective doctrine of progress. Another example would be this stuff that we saw so much after 1989, which is history is over, liberal democracy is won, it is the only future that we can envisage. And I think that gave us 20 years of happy illusion, and now we're waking up to a much tougher world in which it's not obvious that democracy is going to prevail, and it's not obvious that autocracy is going to fail. and the international order that we confidently thought was all in place is kind of in ruins. So my view of that actually is that it's not as grim as it sounds. It's kind of a wake-up call. I feel as if I've been slapped in the face by reality, and we just got to wake up and deal with it. And we have seen something that is pretty astonishing and inspiring, that people are prepared to fight to the death to defend their freedom. And we need to remember that that's constitutive of who human beings are. I don't bet on the future on it. It's a fact. And it's a pretty moving one, pretty important one.
The subtitle of the book on Consolation is Finding Solace in Dark Times, and maybe also, in a sense, in dark places. But it's not a dark book. It's a beautifully written book, full of incredibly rich, enlightening, perhaps even bright anecdotes. Two of my favorite are from Holland. So I think, given that I'm not sure everyone in the audience will have already read the book, perhaps you might talk a little bit about these two wonderfully rich anecdotes that took place in Holland that speak in such an interesting way about major intellectual figures, Freud, Mahler, Weber, and also teach us so much about consolation.
He's much more generous to me than I deserve, but hell, I'm not complaining. Thank you very much, Andrew. Yes, this book, I guess I'm going into selling mode, but it is a fact that the book has been tremendously marked by this country. It began because I was asked by the Utrecht Early Music Festival in Utrecht to give a lecture on justice and politics in the Psalms in the middle of the performance of all 150 of the Psalms by 4 great choirs. And so the project literally began there. I thought, I'm so moved and affected by the Psalms that I wanted to understand why they were having such a cathartic effect on me when I don't happen to believe the hope that they're promising me. So that's where the project began. But the two other examples of the Dutch connection, one of them is in the Mauritshuis. Many of you will know that one of the great paintings in the Mauritshuis is Rembrandt's David and Saul, which is an astonishing painting. And it so happens that Max Weber, one of the greatest, probably the greatest sociologist of the 20th century, in many ways the founder of modern social science, went through a 5-year catastrophic depression, so acute that he couldn't get out of bed, so acute that he couldn't do anything. And then as he began to recover a little bit, he began a kind of ceaseless, restless traveling everywhere. And one of the places he ends up is at the Mauritshuis. And he leaves his wife behind and travels, and he sends his wife a little postcard about David and Saul, the Rembrandt painting. And it's a fantastic little postcard because Marianne Weber, his wife, who later wrote his biography, took this postcard to be the first sign that he was recovering, the first sign that he was kind of coming back to her and coming back from the dead, that he would take the trouble to send her a postcard from the Mauritshuis. But what it's about is the deep understanding that Weber has for the anguish of Saul. Those of you who know the painting know that it captures the moment in which Saul, tormented by madness, is just about to reach for the spear which he's going to hurl at David, and narrowly misses killing him. And Rembrandt catches this moment, and what makes the painting so incredibly dramatic is that Saul's face registers both annihilating rage, I'm going to kill David, and simultaneous haunted regret at what he's about to do. And somehow Weber, it spoke directly to Weber's sense of an inner divide, lacerating rage towards his own father, deep shame at his rage towards his father, all the psychic struggle of a clever man or someone captured in this thing. The other one,
and this is a perfect segue because there's a Freudian element to that, isn't it?
Yes. Oh yeah, this is Freud country. And then the second place where the Netherlands plays a central role is in, it's a famous moment when Gustav Mahler is conducting in Holland. Holland was one of the places that gave Mahler, was one of the first audiences that really understood Mahler's music, so he had a deep connection to the Netherlands. But he was desperate. His marriage was collapsing. His wife was having an affair with Walter Gropius. He was being tormented by that. He couldn't finish his final symphony, and he calls up Freud and says to Freud, "I need your help." And so Freud said, "Well, I'll come and see you." And so Freud went to Leiden, and they walked up and down the canals in Leiden for 4 or 5 hours. And Freud conducted a kind of instant analysis of Gustav Mahler. It's a kind of travesty in a way. I mean, I want to be supportive of Freud, but honest to God, you don't do an analysis walking up and down a canal. This is, and
the amazing thing about the story is he charged him for it, right?
Yes. That's right. And when Mahler died, and Mahler died 2 years later, Freud sent the Mahler estate a bill for a professional consultation. So
I don't know what Marx would have said about that. You know some of Marx's observations about his own people. One of the things I learned about you, Michael, about this book is how deeply musical you are. And Mahler is the key figure in musical consolation. But given your interest in Russia, there's a wonderful section on Anna, you'll pronounce it better than I do, Akhmanatova. I wondered if we might have had a little section on Shostakovich.
good idea. What would you propose for me? I'm up for it.
Well, whereas Mahler's consolation was so personal, and maybe he wouldn't get in this sense because Shostakovich's consolation was collective in his music.
Yes. Oh. Yeah, there's a really truly heartbreaking Shostakovich quartet, which he wrote in Dresden in 1947 or 8. You can imagine what it's like working in Dresden. It's been flattened by Allied bombing. It's a complete lunar landscape. And he's sent by the Soviet authorities to, I don't know, do something. And he writes one of the most despairing of his quartets. Part of what this book is saying is that some of the most consoling music and literature you're ever going to read or hear is the most despairing. And this is a paradox. It puts into words or into sounds what you're feeling, and that has the effect of making you feel I'm not alone. Somebody out there understands what I'm going through. There's a chapter in the book about Mahler's Kindertoten Lieder, songs on the death of children. 5 absolutely beautiful orchestral songs that he wrote, setting to music some poems written by a man who'd lost his children. Why did Mahler write songs on the death of children? Because he'd lost 3 of his brothers when he was growing up. Child mortality was an absolutely constant scourge for families, and he had experienced it like everybody else. The particularly tragic aspect of the Mahler story, of course, is that he had a child with Alma Mahler, a young girl that he loved, Marie, and he'd composed all the songs before Marie got ill. And then Marie got scarlet fever and died. And Mahler said very touchingly to a friend, I could write those songs before I lost Marie, but once I lost Marie, I couldn't write them again. And that's an important thing to notice, a great artist acknowledging that there was a grief where music met its match. There was a form of suffering that you couldn't put into words, or you couldn't put into music. And that's, I think, one of the things that's important about Consolation. This is why it's not a happy talk book. If you think about Consolation, you have to think about the very rare experiences that I think all of us have in our life, which leave us inconsolable. There's nothing to say. There's nothing that's going to make it better. And I think Mahler is acknowledging that in that remark to his friend. But having said that, he managed to produce these 5 beautiful songs, which are among the most comforting and consoling pieces of music ever written. So there you go.
It's a very personal book, Michael, on lots of levels. And I want to, as we get to the end of this, I want to talk on the personal side a bit more. But 2 of my favorite chapters were on Montaigne and Hume. And maybe I'm being a little Freudian here, but I'm guessing perhaps that these are men who you feel you have something personally or certainly intellectually in common with. Are there people in the book who really resonated with you in terms of your life? Hume and Montaigne, because of their reason as they were surrounded by unreason.
I particularly feel that about Montaigne. You know, we've been through a pandemic. There is a horrible war at the gates of Europe. Our future is very uncertain economically. It's uncertain spiritually. And it's very easy to think in those situations, nobody has ever been in this situation before. And it's important, if you go back to Montaigne in the 1580s, to remember that this incredibly joyful, funny, smart, sardonic, witty human being was living in the middle of a civil war and living in the middle of the plague. I mean, it got so bad that Montaigne had to leave his chateau and take to the road. And so for 8 months in the 1580s, when he was kind of an elderly man, he had to lead his family from one house to another to escape the plague. And think about that. We've got modern science. He had nothing. You know, they were applying leeches to people to cure the thing. And he's living in a world in which, you know, he's literally on his horse walking, you know, driving through the fields with his family, and he's seeing peasants digging their own graves and lying in the graves and waiting to die. I mean, that's the world he's in. And yet, out of that, he produces some of the, as I say, some of the wisest, most compassionate, most thoughtful writing that any human being's ever written. And so, throughout the book, I try to reconnect these texts to the lives that produced them. And this is a pretty astonishing example of somebody producing joy and hope and resilience in the middle of just an awful period. So I hope that message comes through if you read the book.
Francis Fukuyama has a new book out on liberalism, and he argues that the foundation of liberalism is a desperate attempt, and I talked about this in the introduction, to create a space in society which isn't political. The world that Montaigne was part of course, was the period of these incredibly bloody, insane religious civil wars, out of which Fukuyama believes liberalism was born. Do you see this connection between Montaigne and Consolation and liberalism?
I certainly, to go back to Fukuyama, I think it's deeply wise to think that you want to have large parts of our life that are not politicized. And one of the things that has been really depressing about the last 20, 30 years is everything's politicized. Gender identity, sexual identity, personal identity, your clothes, your political expressions about everything. And I think that's making conversation difficult. It's making human contact difficult. A kind of liberal has this hopeful fantasy that you can have a political order in which the guy is a conservative. He has very different values. But you play soccer every Saturday. There's just a whole realm of areas where you just enjoy being together, and you bracket, you pause, you park political disagreements. And the wisdom of a free society is a society that doesn't politicize everything, doesn't make everything into a statement of allegiance. And I think Montaigne is one of the spokesmen for that view, because he was a Catholic, a practicing Catholic, in the middle of a Protestant region. And he'd lived, 30, 40, 50 years of his life with Protestant neighbors, and it was fine. And then suddenly, the Protestant warlords are arresting him when he goes out for a ride in the country. And he's thinking, how do I get the hell out of this? Suddenly his Catholicism, which isn't for Montaigne the most important part of Michel de Montaigne, suddenly becomes a death sentence. If he can't talk himself out of this, encounter with these Protestant warlords, he's dead. And I think he has a sense of a catastrophe is happening here. This is a polarization so acute that people who used to be neighbors are now enemies. And and this is quite close to us. We as you know, Canada is a perfect country, a model of liberal tolerance. Well, we had a demonstration on our parliament about 3 or 4 months ago, in which a bunch of truckers basically shut Parliament down for close to 3 weeks, and the government felt it had to invoke the emergency legislation. And you thought, how did we get there? How was it possible for a bunch of hard-working truckers, and everybody in this room knows where your dinner comes from. It comes from truckers, right? Every one of us knows where your shoes come from. They're delivered by truckers. These people are the salt of the earth. But somehow they had got into a state of mind which they felt so so ignored, so not listened to, that when the government said you have to have a mandatory vaccination to get in your cab to cross the border, they went, kaboom, and so we ended up with an occupation of our country, of our nation's capital, which came that close to real violence. And that's the kind of stuff that should worry us. I mean, and that's why I don't think democracies are necessarily stable. That's why I don't think, we're out of the woods. That's why I don't think the problem's somewhere else. I think the problem's right here sometimes. So.
There aren't a lot of analytical Anglo-American philosophers in this book. There aren't any, in fact, except maybe Hume. There are a lot of continental thinkers, particularly in the existential tradition. I love the section on Camus. I don't even know if Camus is an existentialist. I don't even know what existentialism means. Maybe he's a liberal existentialist. But are there particular schools of contemporary thought that you think are better at addressing and thinking through consolation than others?
I guess the answer is no, and that's probably an answer of extreme ignorance, and there's probably somebody in the room who's a trained philosopher or a psychologist, psychoanalyst, who will come up to me afterwards and say, boy, are you wrong. Here's a list of 20 books that you've got to read, so this is an open invitation to be corrected, because I'm probably wrong. But I don't feel, in writing this book, that I'm connecting to a broad strand of discussion of this issue. I was in Paris recently, and looking in the bookstores, I begin to see there's some very interesting, and because it's French, unbelievably complicated philosophical thinking about consolation. But I'm a glutton for punishment. I'm going to read this stuff and figure out. It's a subject to one side. I don't think it's in the mainstream of philosophy at all. It's not, and I'm not a philosopher. I'm a historian. So I don't know who to talk to. Is maybe what I'm saying. Except to you.
But the Camus chapter is brilliant, and I think Camus is so much in the news because the plague has been reinvented or reread during COVID. What is it about Camus that is so instructive on consolation, Michael?
Well, I try to locate Camus in the Second World War. He writes The Plague from 1942 through 1946 or 7, in the middle of the German occupation, in the middle of the resistance to Nazi terror. And I guess the message I took from Camus, which surprised me, it wasn't the thing I thought I would come out of, was he has a lot to say about absurdity. The world is absurd. The world makes no sense. There is no overall meaning to the world. And certainly in occupied France in 1942 to 1945, that was a pretty easy thing to believe. The world was completely upside down, and also terribly shocking. That is, people that you thought were your friends suddenly end up collaborating with the Germans, so your sense of moral expectation towards your friends is completely overturned. And that would give you a sense of the absurd. And his sense that our existence is absurd is the sense that we can't give some overarching meaning to it that these traditions once could, right? That's what I think he means by absurdity, and I don't think that's wrong. I don't think there is a overarching story to replace this one. And so what do you do is kind of what Camus says. And the thing that I took from Camus' book was his very wonderful descriptions of people caring for each other. It's a part of the book that people don't notice, but one of the heroines in the book is a little old lady who is the doctor's mother, who spends a night by the bedside of the doctor's best friend as the doctor's best friend dies. And it's one of the most touching descriptions in literature of what it is to console a dying person. And the larger message I take from that incredibly beautiful passage in the book is the world may be absurd, the world may not have meanings, the world may not have the meanings that this place embodies, but our duties here and now are perfectly clear. Our duties are not absurd. We should be by the bedside of people so they do not die alone, is what Camus is saying. And that seems to me a fantastically powerful message. You know, and you kind of hope that's what you'll be able to do when, you know, those I love, you know, need me to be there. I mean, it's just, you got to step up, you know.
It's pretty serious, but you also suggest that consolation can be funny. Your chapter on Havel, who I think was a friend of yours, and you're a big admirer of him, reveals perhaps a more humorous side of consolation.
Well, he was he was an extraordinary character, Václav Havel, and he was. I chart the story of how he's in prison in 1983. And he's done 3 years in prison for being a Czech dissident. And he wrestles with a moment of shame in his past, which just seems fascinating to me, that of all the things he was worried about in prison, it was the memory of having given in to his interrogators years before and signed a deal with interrogators that left him ashamed of what he'd done. And what he took from that was a very interesting point about failure. You have to own it all the way down. You can't pretend, Havel says, that you were someone else when you did that. You're the same person who failed, who betrayed your principles then. So you've got to own your life, is one of the things that Havel says, which seems to me is very profound. And if you don't own all of your life, you'll split yourself into bits. You'll never pull it together. And so he used prison to pull himself together and own all of the kinds of people he was. Now, Havel's a complicated story, because no sooner had he got out than he began to have a series of rather complicated affairs with some of his best friends' wives. I mean, his personal life is, to say the least, interesting. But he wasn't a hypocrite. He wanted to face up to that too, because he knew that was a problem. But I like him precisely because of his deep fallibility. This is a real
I got
being.
2 more questions, and then I'm going to open it up because I don't want to hog all your time. It's a very personal book, Michael. At the end of it, one of the last chapters, you visit Milosz, the Polish poet, actually in Berkeley, where the Bay Area, from where I'm from, with your wife Shoshana. What's for you? And he reads to you a poem that the two of you has particular meaning. You couldn't have written this book 30 years ago, could you?
No, you got to get some miles on the speedometer, you know. You got to go around. Yeah, I think it's a book that you write when you get to be as old as I am. I notice that I sometimes find with younger audiences that I talk to, they kind of scratch their heads. Why do I need to be consoled for anything? You know, I'm 23 years old. I got the whole rest of my life in front of me. Why is that my problem? Well, consolation becomes, I think, more and more of an issue as you get older. Simply because consolation is about what is irremediable, how you deal with the things in your life that cannot be changed. The fact that your mom is dead, your dad is dead, the fact that you never see your brother anymore, or the fact that you wanted to be this big deal and you failed, the stuff that's irremediable. And because there's stuff that's irremediable in all of our lives, you kind of become aware that they're irremediable as you get older. I think that's what happens. I think young people, quite rightly, don't know that things are irremediable. I certainly didn't when I was 21. Yeah, I think it's a product of this period of my life. And I don't want to sound grim about it. I feel extremely cheerful. I don't know why.
I want to end with one final character who most of you I'd never heard of before I read this book. We all know about Camus and Hume and Diderot and everybody, Marx, Freud, Mahler. But there's a woman who appears at the end of your book, Michael, a London-based woman I'd never heard of, who seems to somehow capture the complexity, the emotion, the meaning, and the hope of your book. Perhaps you might say something about her and what she's actually left us, not just in intellectual terms, but in institutional terms. And then after that, please, we're going to have some questions from the audience.
Yes, we're talking about Cicely Saunders. Cicely Saunders was a doctor and a nurse who more than any single person founded the Hospice movement. And if there are hospices around in the Netherlands, some of it has to do with her, and an amazing generation of nurse practitioners and mostly female physicians who said hospital medicine is doing a terrible job consoling people when they face the last days and weeks of their lives. And what makes her a great figure to me is that she saw this institutional problem. She saw that, both of my parents died in hospital, and it was pretty awful. I mean, there was no space to kind of say anything to anybody. They were alive, and then suddenly they were dead, and there were tubes everywhere, and doctors talking a lot of nonsense at you, and there was no place where we could sit and go through this experience together. And Cicely Saunders understood that and created this institution, the Hospice, in which, and I see it as an institution that created the time and the space for the experience of consolation. And the thing that, and I met her towards the very end of her life. She was a fantastic woman. She was nearly 6 foot, great, big, powerful, white-haired lady. She looked like a sort of country justice of the peace, one of these kind of, with a very cut-glass English accent, ferociously intelligent, and she'd created this worldwide movement. I mean, she was a really amazing woman. But she taught me one thing, and that's what I think I'll end with. She helped me to see that dying is not the end, that the last moments of your life are among the most social moments of your life and the most important moments of your life for those around you. And one of the things you can do as you die is take away the fear of dying for those around you. And a good death is that. A good death says, don't be afraid. And she helped to create the environment in which a person could say that to their loved ones. And that seems to me a very hopeful message. That death is something we can do something with it. We can do something that will take away the fear for others. And I learned that from Cicely Saunders, who spent 40 years doing something that people mostly don't do, which is she just sat beside the dying and listened to them. And she learned from them. And
and I learned from her. So